Kev, welcome back to This Is Horror podcast.
Man, thank you so much for inviting me back. It is great to be here.
Yeah, the last time we spoke for the podcast, it is getting on for 3 years now because we actually last put out a podcast in August 2021.
I remember
So
it was when Below had just been released.
it was indeed. And as you probably anticipated, because this is what I ask everyone returning, I want to know what have been the biggest changes for you, both personally and really in the past 3 years?
Well, goodness, quite a lot of things. I mean, personally, it's been a real whirlwind of a time. I think a lot of people will probably relate to this because it's sort of the sort of later tendrils of the pandemic, like because obviously 2021, we were still sort of in the thick of it. I don't think anyone really knew what the kind of end game would look like. But me working as an English teacher in Western Europe, it kind of ended up changing the way my work schedule and my work life balance kind of uh, looked in kind of what was going to be a permanent way, basically, which has resulted in me actually stepping away from full time teaching during the school year, which has been a massive change because I was doing it for about 12 years at that point. No, 10 years, yeah. And so since about 2022, I've actually been doing sort of part time hours during the school year and then a very, very intensive summer program at universities in the UK to make most of my income for the year. So that's been a massive change for me career wise in terms of my non writing career.
Yeah, and so in terms of having that writing routine and having that balance between the teaching and writing, I'm wondering what that looks like now and if the pattern that you've kind of got into is one that you think you'll be in permanently or at least for the semi long term.
I mean, I definitely like it to be a long term arrangement because, as I say, the kind of upshot of COVID was that really instead of having sort of blocks of free time in my life that I used to have as a teacher, when normally I'd be teaching in the evenings and free in the mornings and the early afternoons, it got to the point where I was really sort of only having an hour or two free a day. And that was it sandwiched in the middle of work, like lots of early starts and late finishes. And obviously, as like when you're extremely tired, like you're definitely not producing the best in terms of writing either. So it just didn't really make sense. And I was making less money than I'm making now anyway. So it just didn't really make sense to keep doing it. But in terms of the writing, yeah, I'm finding it took a while to get a groove going, because I think it's quite easy to get sidelined when there's been such a big change, because I got very much into this kind of rhythm of like, say 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. was my writing time, like 4 days a week or 5 days a week, depending on the week. And suddenly that kind of that pressure to create in that morning originally was no longer really there. And I kind of had more time where I could, sort of say, oh, this week I'll do Tuesday afternoon, but then things crop up. So took a bit of time of adjustment, but I think now I'm kind of on top of it. And yeah, the last sort of year or so, I've managed to write about 3 novellas in about 14 months, I suppose. And that's full first draft, one edited to a submitted to publisher draft. So I feel like the productivity has kind of kicked in now, and I've kind of got myself in a place where I'm really happy with that schedule and how it works.
So it's interesting that you said that you've written 3 novellas in the past 14 months because I think people who have read your work, they're probably most familiar with the novella format. But of course, today we're going to talk about your debut novel.
Absolutely.
A lot of people, when they go to novel, they kind of stay almost on that track. But do you think the
Yeah.
novella is the form that you prefer? Is it purely coincidence and you work on the story and it just so happens that these stories have been novella?
I mean, I'm a great believer in exactly what you just said. Really, that different stories have different lengths that they need to be, and I try not to kind of shoebox my stories into either novella or novel or novelette or whatever it might be. Um, but actually, with these three novellas I'm working on, these are ones that I'm writing for a contract I got given towards the end of last year, I think, or maybe the year before, with Lycan Valley Press, where they've actually bought, they've signed me up for four folkloric horror novellas. They're the publisher that actually did my first novella, The Balance. And they very much liked it. They said it was one of their better sellers. Might have been their best seller actually, but I can't confirm that. So I'm not going to wear that badge because I'm not sure I have the right to. But it's certainly one of their better sellers. And they came back to me late in 2022 and said, "Have you got any more folkloric horror novellas?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Have you got any ideas for any?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Okay, do you want to have a contract for a couple?" And I was like, "Yeah, fine." And they sent me a contract. They had four on it, and I was like, "Oh, Jesus!" But I mean, it's quite nice to have that kind of belief from the publisher and support. So yeah, that's what I've been ploughing away with for the last sort of year and a bit.
Yeah, and I think we probably both became most familiar with one another's work when we were submitting a lot of stories to Hawk and Cleaver's The Other Stories, these
Absolutely,
2,000 word stories that appeared on their podcast. And of course, each week they would have a different theme. Each month, in fact, I think it
each
was,
month,
or
yeah.
each period, it was normally about a month. But
Mm,
obviously, because of the nature of that, we would write in a great deal of different subgenres. But as
yeah,
you've alluded to here, I mean, a lot of the work that you're doing recently broadly fits under this folklore or this folk horror category. So is this deliberate? Is this something you kind of want to be in, or is this just the way that the stories are coming out at the moment?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's the only thing I want to be in, certainly. I mean, I've got other things in the pipeline, other things that are kind of half written that are somewhat different. I still have that office murder comedy that I will
Yeah,
finish.
yeah, which
I will finish
I
it.
almost referenced there. I'm very excited for that one. I've been anticipating that probably since you told me the idea at a drunken party many years ago when we had
Exactly.
considerably more hair and less white in it. But happy
True
days.
story. Indeed, indeed. That's life. That's how it goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've got other things I want to do as well. I mean, I'm also planning an occult detective series at some point. But it's just like getting things to the front of the queue. You know what I mean? And I'm always very very interested in folklore, and I think folklore as a background for a story, or as like the kind of um, the what can we say, like the legendary element, or like the reason behind a story is a really compelling thing for me. So it's something that I'm sure I will always be dipping my toes back into, even when I do step away from it.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of which, there's a question from this is horror patron and
Mm,
fellow writer and friend Dan Howarth, who
okay.
says that one particularly brilliant blurb for your novel described you as a master of folklore. I know whose blurb that was, by the way. What is your process for delving into lore and history when researching a story?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And the answer is it's often very different depending on the time. So, for example, one of the folkloric horror novellas, the one that I've actually sent back to the publisher finished, or finished until the editor tells me about all the crap things I've done and I have to change, is set in Western France, and it's about fairy folklore, but not the kind of cute Peter Pan fairies. Like, this is the kind of like eat your children kind of fairies, which I prefer, to be honest. Um, and
I
and this
prefer
one
to
came.
read about it, just not to experience it. I don't want my child to be eaten by a fairy or indeed anything else.
I think that's admirable, to be honest,
Thank you.
as a philosophy, as an approach. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so this one came about because I literally saw a picture on Twitter. Let's not call it X. Let's not even go there. On Twitter, and with the picture, there was like a description of what this the image was describing. It was like this French folkloric entity, this kind of like sea fairy thing, and I was like, that's quite interesting. And then I read a bit more, and I was like, oh, the it was one of those kind of folkloric stories where it gets really, really dark, and I was like, okay, I can definitely do something with this. So from there, I kind of looked if anyone else had picked up that myth or legend, and written a horror story about it. They hadn't, so I delved right in, and that kind of wrote itself almost. But with the novel Shadow of the Hidden, which also has a lot of folklore in it, that folklore was a lot more foreign to me, quite literally, because obviously it's much more removed from my day-to-day experience living in Europe. So that involved a lot more digging around, listening to podcasts, reading a few articles, extracts from books, that kind of thing. So it really, really does depend on what the folklore is, how close to home it is, um, and yeah, what I want to do with it as well, I suppose.
Yeah, and with the new book, Shadow of the Hidden, I know, much like the office horror that we referenced, that this is an idea that you have had for a very long time. I think over a decade, in fact, or getting on for that. Now,
Yeah,
we did mention it briefly in the 2021 conversation,
I
but
remember.
as
Yeah.
this is not a podcast where you have to go back and reference other ones and then continue listening, could you tell us a little bit about the origin story and the genesis for this idea?
Well, yeah. So when I lived in Turkey, which was the first place I lived as a teacher living abroad, I had a good friend who had a bar, and his bar's main source of income was they did very good ice cream, and they used to fry the ice cream, and it was the first time I'd seen fried ice cream. Blew my tiny little mind. My God. But anyway, one day we were sitting around playing backgammon, as you do, and an old lady came over and asked him for ice cream. She was a widow, and in their culture, you're supposed to give widows like bread, cheese, milk, tea, coffee, the basics. But she always wanted ice cream, and my friend like used to tell her to bugger off, basically, because like this is his main source of business. He would say to her, I'll get you a coffee if you want. I'll give you some water. Fine. She'd be like, no, 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 ice cream. It's very hot, and he'd be like, get out of here. And then this one day, he did it, and she absolutely freaked out, and she put a curse on him, which obviously in real life, thankfully, nothing really came of it. But something weird happened that night, and my friend was convinced that this jinn curse that she put on him and his family was real, and that he was basically doomed, and his whole family was going to be killed by a sort of pre-Islamic demon. So I was like, calm down, fella. It's probably going to be fine, and it was fine. But in the story, I wondered, like, what would that look like if it did happen? And what's really interesting is, as you say, I kind of carried this story around for a long time, and then about 5 years ago, I kind of had some more ideas about cast members and people who could be involved, and at pretty much exactly that time, the lawyer and podcaster um, Rabia Chowdhury, who did some work with the original Serial and some other things. She put out a podcast called The Hidden Gin. And her podcast was just amazing for me because I was at the time where I was thinking, I really want to write this story, but I need more information. And she was putting out these podcasts with her experience as a Pakistani American and her knowledge of the jinn, but also referencing where these stories came from with like really useful articles, really useful books. And so I was just like gobbling this up and just kind of expanding my knowledge so I could write the story basically. So that's kind of where the story comes from.
So you said that the evening after this ice cream loving widow put a
Mm.
curse on your friend that something strange happened. What was the strange thing that happened?
Yeah, so basically, his massive ice cream trolley, which was like really massive, it was like, it was like 15 flavor jobs on casters, like was moved during the middle of the night when we were asleep, probably drunk, um, in the flat above. It was moved into the middle of the street where the sun fell directly in the morning. Um, and the weird thing about it is like this fridge, this ice cream fridge, was bloody heavy. I mean, we're talking like, I think it's like 250 kilos before he had any ice cream in it. So it's really, really heavy. And like I couldn't move it myself. I'm not the strongest man, as you well know. But even my friend who was, he'd done military service and stuff, he couldn't move it easily alone. So it was pretty weird that sort of during the middle of the night, and also normally as well, it was chained up. And we always check the chain before we went to bed. We checked the chain that night before we went to bed after going to this bar nearby for drinks. It was closed and the chain had just been opened up. Thing moved into sunshine. All of his stock destroyed. And he was convinced it was the gin. And I was like, no, she's probably just got some really beefy relatives that she's got to mess you up.
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly what you just said seemed to be the logical explanation.
Right. Exactly.
You know, particularly if it's like, right, it's either a supernatural entity or it's some
Or
big,
just some strong
strong
lads.
boys. And I think
Of which there are
probably,
several in that area of
yeah,
Turkey. They're not hard to
yeah,
come by.
yeah. But I can understand him being disturbed by that and by the timing. I presume that
I think
afterwards she
especially
never
because
came
that
back
is
in.
such. No, she didn't. She never came back. No,
Yeah.
and I think that kind of superstition as well is such an ingrained part of their culture that like if someone talks about it, they get really kind of on edge, and so I think that kind of magnified the fear for him. Whereas for me, it was like, what are you talking about?
Now I wonder, because you did so much research. I mean, we've said before that you're an atheist and you don't have much belief in these
Mm,
kind of things. But did
if
you,
any.
yeah, did you stumble upon anything that was kind of harder to explain, or did you ever have any moments where you doubted your lack of belief, or you thought, maybe there is something in that one?
I mean, I didn't doubt my lack of belief. I wouldn't say because uh, I'm fairly convinced about uh, there not being any supernatural entities. But one thing I did find fascinating, actually, which kind of makes its way into the book, is stories of these people, especially normally kids, actually, who are what they call jinn masters these days. And this happens quite a lot in quite a lot of Arabic civilizations, where basically these kids like have like a pet jinn. Sounds absolutely mental, doesn't it? And the pet jinn often like helps them like find like valuable things and stuff like this. And there are quite a lot of sort of quite well documented stories of kids, with like limited education, from a poor neighborhood. They suddenly attract a pet gin, find loads of valuable stuff that's just been like buried somewhere, and end up like enriching their families to like sort of quite enormous levels of wealth. And it's really quite bizarre, like that this can happen. But I mean, it might just be they stumble upon something. It might be they heard a rumor. It might be an elaborate ruse. Who knows? But I did find those kind of stories compelling. I definitely wanted to bring one of those characters into the book when I read about those.
I mean, it's interesting how sometimes belief can correlate with mindset and can correlate with action. So if you generally think that you have this pet gin that is going to help you find wealth, then you might go out and actively seek these opportunities more. Whereas if you don't believe that, then you're not going to go digging around for gold. You got other
Yeah,
things to do, like eat ice cream, but ice cream that you were paid for rather than
exactly.
demanded. So
Quite
yeah,
bloody right as well.
but I do think there's a lot to do with belief and then actual, not manifestation, because then that makes it sound like there's more a spiritual component. But I mean, even when we talk about writing and we talk about success, obviously there is a lot of luck involved. There is a lot of opportunities coming along at the right time. But I do
Yeah,
think the more you write, the more tickets, as it were, you have to getting lucky, to having that big break. So if you
for
believe
sure.
that it could happen, you're more likely to put the work in, and then you're actually more likely to have that success. I mean, that's the way
Yeah, and
that
I
I've
think not
typically
even
done
just
things.
not even just writing more, but also like writing with conviction. Like I'm writing this to get published. I'm not writing this, just for a laugh. So I'm going to take the editing process seriously. I'm going to take my word choices more seriously. I'm going to take my storycraft and plotting more seriously. So I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I agree. Like when you have that kind of conviction that's based in something else, then maybe it is going to make you, as you say, do more of the things that will lead you to ultimately having success, whatever we define that as.
And how do you think your mindset and your perception of yourself as a writer has changed in these past 3 years?
As you can probably imagine from your own experience, it's up and down. There are times when I feel like um, things are better. I mean, I definitely feel like when I read back Shadow of the Hidden, as I've been doing, obviously a lot uh, with the final editing process, proofreading, and doing a few readings and stuff like this, which I'll be doing more of this week coming at AuthorCon, which we'll talk about in a bit, I suppose. Um, I do feel that is a stronger book than any of the books I've written before, which is very good. So, I mean, that I think is a really good gauge of my own improvement. Um, I think one thing I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, and this again maybe is something that you can empathize with too, um, is that I've been working a lot on long form work, and that has meant that I've not had as much time to put into short stories. And the kind of upshot of that is that you do kind of sometimes get that envy of, like, you see a submission call that you fancied having a crack at, and then you see, oh, it closed yesterday. Oh, I really wish I'd had time to do that. But like you said before, many times, you can do anything, but you can't do everything, right? So you kind of just have to take that on the chin. So that's not really a perception of myself as a writer, but maybe it's like a um, fear of missing out a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, that's something I actually relate to very recently, because I feel probably the last 2 or 3 years, or maybe even longer, I haven't really looked at any short story calls because I've been so obsessed in terms of finishing my long form works. And there's like literally a backlog at the moment. I mean, when I finish the current novella that I'm working on, I've then just got to choose out of another three that are all in different stages. So I feel,
Absolutely.
I mean, I want to get them done because I want to then be able to move on to completely fresh ideas. But whilst they're not done, it's like, let's work on those. But I was thinking back to the time where, I mean, there was a year where I literally submitted to every single The Other Stories call.
I
And I
remember.
thought I kind of miss that because, I mean, I suppose I have a mode or a style of writing that I often gravitate towards, but in
Sure.
doing this Other Stories cool, it meant that I was writing a great variety, and in a great variety of different subgenres. And I thought I quite like to do that again. So that there's part of me that's wondering, like, should I just make 2025, the year where it's like, right, Dan and Luke and the rest of the gang, I'm back. I'm
Let's
submitting
go back
to
to this.
every
Yeah.
to every call. And I think as well, like we consider obviously the market, we look at the quality of the market, we look at the pay as well. And obviously with
Mm.
them being an independent small outfit, they can't compete with like a trad press that can, put these like well beyond pro rates of pay. But I think what they do, it's so kind of pure and it's so good. And so, yeah, I'm really
Production quality
considering
is
just,
really second to none, almost, isn't it? It really is.
well, yeah, I mean, almost literally second to none, because for me, in terms of the best kind of audio production podcast for short stories, it is between them and No Sleep podcast.
Yeah,
And I
yeah. And I don't
wouldn't
really
like
see
to
anyone
say who's
else kind of
first or
competing on
who's
that level. Yeah,
second.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
I think the other thing as well about writing short stories that I miss is, and I did get one which, strangely enough, went to the other stories towards the end of last year, which I really enjoyed writing because I think you can be much more experimental when you're writing short fiction. I mean, some people, carry that experimental nature into their long fiction and do it incredibly well. I'm thinking of people like Joe Koch and people like that, you know. But I mean, certainly, I don't feel I have the chops to write a 70,000 word book of such experimental material. Whereas, when I'm playing in a 2 to 4,000 word wheelhouse, I really feel like I can kind of go, okay, let's just put the rules in the bin and have some fun. You know what I mean? So I kind of miss that a little bit as well. So yeah, I think I definitely will. Once I've written these 4 novellas, I'm going to take a bit of time to kind of give myself permission to write some more shorts and be more playful with the boundaries of what I write and what my voice is and so forth.
Yeah, and as we've been talking about Hawk and Cleaver, I
Mm,
don't know if you're able to talk about this. So if you're not, then just giving myself more editing work, really. But I understand that the novel Shadow of the Hidden, there will be an audiobook version that will be out via Hawk and Cleaver. So
I'm
can
afraid
you
not.
tell
No,
us
no.
anything about that?
No, it's not. No, I did actually approach them about it, and I think what they ultimately decided was that the size of the book was just too much, because they've done one novella so far, which was Dan Howarth's excellent Territory, which was brilliantly adapted as well. Um, and they ultimately decided that if they do want to do more audiobooks, but they want to do novellas up to 35,000 max, and Shadow of the Hidden's about just under 10,000 words more than that. And they just felt it was too much to take on at this stage of the Genesis. So I've actually used Voice 123 to uh, get hold of some auditions for audiobook.
Mm.
And I have actually now selected the narrator, and he is busily working away at that at the moment.
Oh, well, that's excellent news. And I mean, I
I don't know if you've had this
presume.
experience. Well, I know you have had this experience actually before, but when you are auditioning for audiobooks, it is the weirdest thing in the world because when I use Voice 123, they give you 25 auditions, so you have to listen
Mm,
to 25 auditions of the first chapter of the novel, and so it's like same thing being read by 25 people. Like 3 or 4 of them were rubbish, so I just threw them in the bin straight away. Said, yeah, thanks, no thanks. But then the other 20 odd, like 20, 21 auditions, really good. So I ended up listening back to this first chapter of my book like 70 times by 20 voices in about 2 days. And I felt like I was going completely insane by the end.
yeah, the way that I typically do it is I try to get recommendations, all right, because I
Mm,
listen to a lot of audiobooks myself. I'll like see, okay, who are the narrators that I really enjoy personally. Um, I tend to find that if I can get a recommendation, then that's better because, of course, not only can they vouch for the narrator and their performance, but also in terms of how easy was it to work with them, how
sure. Yeah.
easy was it in terms of editorial changes. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the two narrators that I have worked with, and I don't mind saying, they've pretty much said that I'm the most meticulous of the authors that they've worked with. almost to the point of annoyance, you know.
This is my
I,
surprised face.
yeah. Yeah. So I think as well, because I can be where can be means almost
Like a stickler for
99.9% of the
detail.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
really pedantic in
Mm.
terms of detail. It is important to have somebody who is open to changes. But then I feel as well, the first time that you've worked with someone is probably the hardest, because not only do they understand how I am to work with, but I can know what the limitations are. How many times can we go over this and I still maintain my professional relationship with them?
Nice, nice.
And I mean, so far things have worked out okay. I had RJ Bailey to begin with. I worked with him when he was really just starting out, and
Yeah.
he asked me if I'd be interested in working
Was it
with
Water for
him, and
Drowning
so
he did first by
Water
Ray
for
Cleary?
Drowning was the
Yeah,
first one,
fantastic.
yeah.
Yeah.
And steadily he has become more known, which has meant that his rates have gone up and up and up, as is the case. And when it
Good luck
came
to
to
him, of
House of
course.
Bad Memories, I mean, not only just the rates, but his demand has gone up. So in terms of the
Mm.
time scale, it
Yeah.
wasn't really possible. But then David Moody put me on to the narrator Aubrey Parsons,
Yes.
and David had gone through various audiobook narrators before just really gelling with Aubrey. And so, yeah, working with him was fantastic as well. And,
He
in
also
terms
has
of,
a Midlands accent as well, doesn't he?
well, actually, have you listened to the audiobook?
I've listened to a preview of it.
Okay, so actually, Aubrey is from Wales, but he can
Whoa.
do pretty much any accent. So if you listen to some of the books that he has done for David Moody, the first book that he ever did, the opening is a prologue as a woman from Yorkshire, and he nailed that. If
Oh
you
my
go
God.
to his website, he can pretty much do any accent. So
Amazing.
I think it's testament to that you actually thought he was from the Midlands.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that is all put on.
That is just put on. Wow. Fantastic.
Um, I mean, I did an interview with him as part of the House of Bad Memories podcast weekend, so then
Mm.
you can hear his real voice should you want to
Okay. I'm
in
going to
that
check that one
very
out. I've
conversation.
listened to a lot of that weekend, but not all of it.
Yeah, well, that's understandable. There were many hours
Many
in that
hours.
weekend, and
Yeah.
I may have gone over the top with the promotion that I did, but you've got to give your book every chance. And I mean,
I
that
agree.
links us back to you and the things that you're doing for Shadow of the Hidden. So
Yeah.
what are you doing to promote it? I mean, you're over in America right now, so there's a
Yeah.
fairly big step.
Yeah. I'm in the USA this week. I'm going to AuthorCon 3, which is run by Scares That Care. Um, so they also raise money for awesome charity, which is the reason why I thought this was a particularly good convention to attend. But also, everyone I've spoken to who's been there before has really enjoyed it, had a great time. Um, and I'm actually sharing a table and a hotel room with Mike Clark, who wrote the adventure horror novel Hell on High, and before that, the series Patience of a Dead Man, which he's bringing back in a new version quite soon. But he actually visited Portugal because his wife's Brazilian and she wanted to see Portugal forever. He visited about 3 years ago now. God, time flies, or I'm getting old, or both. And we went out for dinner with those guys and had a really good time. So it just felt like natural when Mike said he was interested in going. I was like, hey, dude, do you want to share a room, share a table, sell some books? So I'm going to this convention, which is really exciting. It's the first one I'm going to kind of as like trying to sell stuff, like with an author table. I'm also doing a reading at 5 p.m. on Saturday afternoon with Tony Evans, which should be really good fun. A little bit nervous, quite nervous actually, but looking forward to it as well. So yeah, I just figured with this novel, like I said, I feel like it is a really big step for me in terms of my capacity as a writer. Like I really felt like that I really landed this well, and so I wanted to give it all the best opportunity I could for it to do as well as it could and find as many readers as it can. So that's kind of why I'm over here this week.
When you say that you're doing a reading with Tony Evans, do you mean that you're both reading at the same event, or are you literally doing a reading together?
Oh no, we're doing it at the same event. So basically, like in on the AuthorCon program, they have like readings in one of the rooms throughout the day, and it's always like two authors paired together. And I think it's no coincidence that Tony's got a couple of really nice folk horror books, so they kind of paired him up with me. So nice job, Brian Keane, with that one.
Yeah, and I mean, do you often get nervous when it comes to doing book readings? Because I mean, obviously you do like quite a lot of, I suppose, semi-public speaking in the sense that, your day job is being a teacher and lecturing and things like that. But as I know, obviously, teaching and doing a book reading are completely different. So, yeah, I'm wondering if it's the book reading itself or if it is more because of the stakes of this particular book.
I think it's the reading itself. I mean, this is actually the first reading I'm ever going to have done in person. I mean, I've done a couple online, but I feel like the kind of safety, as it were, of like having the screen and like the machine between you and the audience means that it isn't really quite so terrifying. So I think speaking in front of an audience in that sense of kind of performing, it's gonna be the first time I've done it. So I really don't know. I'm guessing that I'm going to be nervous. Hopefully, I won't. Hopefully, I'll take to it like a duck to water. But I suspect I'll be a little bit nervy at the very least.
And do you try to throw in performative aspects to the reading? I mean, I know that from author to author, it varies. Some people do a straight reading, others will, have different accents, maybe channel their Aubrey Parsons a little bit. Others, there'll be some more kind of physical comedy, and then, you can go all the way up to Josh Malaman and Chuck Palahniuk, who turn it into some show where they're throwing things out into the audience, and it's this mad kind of participatory event.
I think something that you and I in our writing have in common is that we tend to have quite a bit of dialogue. And so I think if you're reading something that has sort of quite a dense volume of dialogue within the text, I think it kind of necessitates a bit more of a performative approach so that people kind of keep hold of, who is speaking, when, and to who, and like, that inflection of like, stress words and if people are raising their voices, that kind of thing. So I suspect I will be, yeah, trying to make it more performative, maybe like uh, like a audio drama type approach. So I'll try my best with the accents. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, see, this is why I did wonder if you were literally doing the reading with Tony, because I mean, a
Ah,
number of times I've had like a double act. I did one with Bob Pastorella for
yeah,
their watching, and then actually for the House of Bad Memories launch, me and Laurel Hightower performed Things We Say, which
yeah,
was
yeah,
one of
yeah.
my first short story
Fantastic.
uh, acceptances. So yeah, and any opportunity I can do the double act read, I do. So
Yeah, amazing.
maybe one day people will
Maybe
get
one
the
day. Yeah.
yeah. There you go. We can't wait for that day. Like literally, we have to get on with the interview. Otherwise, it would be an abrupt ending.
Exactly.
And I mean, there seems to be a lot of autobiography within Shadow of the Hidden. I mean, less so in terms of the actual events, but I mean, people who are familiar with you will know how seriously you take your food and cuisine.
Yes.
And there are a lot
Uh-huh.
of very specific, almost indulgent, but not in a way that detracts, kind of descriptions of the food that they're eating. And then, of
Yeah.
course, I mean, they go from place to place. There are parts set in Turkey, in Cairo, in Tunisia. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering, how much of you has gone into this story and how many real life experiences from the places that you've traveled to have gone into this.
I mean, I can confirm I've eaten all the food. So like that's definitely a box ticked. But yeah, I mean, like you say, the events themselves are very much not from my life experience, obviously, but the places are places that I feel I know very well, and um, I feel like those places were highly appropriate for the kind of story I wanted to tell because, the setting in Tunisia in Kairouan, for example, is like the fourth most holy city in the Islamic world. So that kind of felt right to include that in a story that's about their sort of mythological backgrounds, and obviously the citadel and the necropolis in Cairo as well felt like a natural kind of place to send these people on their adventure as well. And again, it's someone that I know very well. Um, with the food, I think, I mean, I thought about this, and the reason I think the food is such an important part of the description is that I think a lot of the people reading this book purely by virtue of the fact that the majority of horror readers in English are from the United States. Um, a lot of people will not really have that great familiarity with these locations, and I think that along with obviously the descriptions of scenery and so on, and language and sights and smells and sounds, I think food can really ground you in a place. Like I really believe that if you haven't had the food somewhere, you really haven't been there, in some sense. So I think that was the reason I employed so much of that, partly because I love it, but partly because also I feel like it puts people in that place and lets them feel like they are living that experience along with Seb and Oz and Dennis.
Yeah, I include a lot of food references in my work as well, because, like you say, I think it is part of the place, but almost to the point that one of the negative reviews to the girl in the video said something along the lines of, "Is this a story or is this a Japanese restaurant guide?" And as I don't reply to reviews, I didn't write anything to that, but I there was a part of me that just wanted to write back, "Why not both?" You
Yeah,
know,
exactly. Just write yes.
if you read the book and then you go to some of the restaurants that I've referenced and you have a good time, then job done. It wasn't the job that you were looking for, but perhaps it was the job that you needed, and now
I
you're
think
eating
also
a delicious meal.
if we think as well about like the times when we have perhaps our most meaningful conversations with other people, a lot of the time that is over a meal, isn't it? Like you because that's the time that you have to stop doing your work or whatever it is that you're busy with in your life and just say, okay, let's just have a conversation while we eat. So I think that is quite a natural thing as well. I know some people really hate food in fiction, so I apologize to those people if they pick up Shadow and just feel sad or empty.
Yeah, but who are these people? Why do they hate it?
Some people hate
Literally,
food.
if you're listening and you hate it, let us know. Why do you hate it?
Yeah,
You
I'd
hate
actually be
food in
interested. Yeah,
general?
yeah. Some people do hate food. Some people like really only eat. Like I've met many people who, not many, but a few people who say, I literally eat food because otherwise I'll die. But I just don't care. And when I meet those people, I'm just like, wow, I will never understand you as a human being. I'm sorry, I just won't.
The only way that I can begin to try and process that is England, as you know, does not
The home
have the
of yellow
best
food.
reputation for good food. So if you had just eaten kind of the typical unseasoned, unsalted food that you can get in some diners and half-hearted establishments. I'm saying
This is taking
some,
me
I'm
back
not
to my
saying
childhood
all.
of having mashed potato,
Right.
which was literally just potatoes with
Yeah.
nothing added apart from water, then boiled until
Yeah.
they dissolved into like a mush. And then
Yeah.
because I thought I hated mashed potatoes for like 15 years of my life. Then I had like real mash with like butter and salt and good stuff.
Exactly.
And I was like, what the hell is this?
So this is what I'm saying. Perhaps these people that hate food, they just haven't had really good food yet. Because like
Okay.
once you learn about good food, once you learn about like different pairings of herbs and spices, like for me, it really opened up in terms of what I can cook.
Yeah. 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 For
And
sure. For sure.
beforehand, it can be quite mundane or bland. So
Mm.
I would suggest and hope, those people who they seem to not
They're
like
just
food is that
inexperienced.
you haven't had the right food yet, but keep going. But
Keep plugging away.
yeah, yeah, keep eating. You'll find something eventually. But I do think that, we're talking about travel and going to different places. I mean, food is a big part of that experience. And,
Of culture,
you
right?
know, yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, if I think about what makes like a country unique, food has to be up there, and obviously the kind of sightseeing and the architecture, but
Yeah. Yeah.
food has to be in the top 5, if not the top 3.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. For sure. For sure. So I'm a strong believer in that as well.
But did you find that, in living in Turkey and indeed in researching this book, did you learn more about Islam and Islamic culture?
Um, well, I'm still very much an atheist, obviously. Um, I kind of like read, for example, things about how like the process of things like exorcism, that kind of stuff. Um, I decided quite deliberately not to go down the exorcism route. Spoiler, small spoiler, um, and that kind of will become apparent for anyone that reads the book. Um, and I think that's as much as anything, not because of the fact that it's set in an Islamic world situation. It's more just that I feel like so many exorcisms have already been done, and like unless you're going to do something really different with it, then I don't really see the value in it. Um, I also really liked as well. There's a book that I read, and I can't remember the title now, but it's in the afterword. I mentioned it in the afterword. I think it's called like The Motivation of the Vengeful Jinn or something like that. And that was a really eye opening thing to me because it really talks about, what the beliefs are around the will of the jinn, and even in Islamic culture, there's a great belief that these things are pre-human, have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and I think a lot of that belief system comes from pre-Islamic, pre-Christian, even kind of myth and legend. So um, yeah, so I kind of learned as much as anything more about sort of like folklore perhaps of the Near East rather than the sort of scripture of the religion, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, I wonder in terms of the writing, and we could include the research as well. What do you think were the easiest and the hardest things about writing this specific story?
I mean, maybe the answer to this question is the same one. When I wrote when I planned the book, I planned for the two gentleman in the book to go to see Dennis, who is the expert, the scriptural expert at the beginning, when the curse is first placed on them. This is very early doors spoiler, so don't worry if you're listening and thinking, "Oh, he's ruining the book." I'm not ruining the book. And the plan was they would talk to this lady. She would give them some info, and off they pop to do their thing. And this is going to sound like such a wanky thing to say, but as I was writing, like she just showed up outside the apartment before they left, and I was like, "Oh, okay." Like it literally was not in the plan for her to come along, but she just came along, and that obviously, yeah, you've read the book, you understand how pivotal she is to the the dynamism of the book, like the direction of travel of the story. And so the idea that I originally had was very much thrown up in the air and kind of reconstructed, but in such a way that like that character had such, I suppose, a dynamic impact on what I was writing that as much as it kind of threw my plans up into the wind, it also kind of probably made it easier to write in some ways because she made it more propulsive for me, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've spoke before to a number of writers about this dichotomy or this difference in approach between planning or pantsing or some sort
Mm.
of hybrid in between. And it would sound like for you, or at least particularly with this story, that you have a similar approach to me in that you will plan it out, but there is flexibility baked in for, changes or for a character to say, actually, we're not going in this direction. So,
Your plan's
yeah.
stupid, Kev. I'm going
Yeah.
to do something else, mate. Yeah.
Is that your typical way of doing things? And since having novellas and novels commissioned and having publishing deadlines, has that shifted your approach to storytelling and story planning?
I mean, I think my first novella, The Balance, I wrote completely pantsed, 100%. But it was a time, I wrote half of that during the Story a Week challenge where I was very much kind of just finding my feet as a writer, experimenting, doing different things. And this kind of just grew out of an idea for a short story that just wasn't possible to finish in a short story length. But then when I came to writing other long form stuff, even as early as Below, in 2019 when I wrote that, I suppose, or 2019, 2020. Um, Even then, I felt like I needed to have at least some kind of guide ropes to follow, like along the path. So I don't really ever make a kind of meticulous plan, scene by scene, but I kind of have things where I say to myself, okay, they need to do this, and they need to do this, and they need to do this in order to reach the conclusion. Um, and then how they get from point A to B to C to D is kind of more go with the flow. It's interesting actually because the book I'm writing at the moment is the first one I've written long form set in the UK, and that's got two point of view protagonists who are sisters, and that I've been a bit more belligerent with the structure, and it's not really necessarily to do with the time. It's just that I have a very clear idea immediately that I conceived of it of where I wanted it to go. So I think this is an outlier rather than necessarily a change of approach.
I feel that I haven't seen much fiction of yours that's really rooted in the UK. So
Mm.
as soon as you said that, I'm immediately intrigued,
It's very
especially as
political, Michael. It's very political.
well, I want to go there. What can you tell us about it?
So, well, basically, it's about two sisters. One of them is a spirit painter. Do you know what that is?
Spirit painter, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I can guess from the description, but
What they do
rather
is they
than me
paint spirits down
imagining
already.
that
Um,
that wasn't the guess, but why don't you tell
um,
me?
so it's a specific type of psychic medium. Again, I don't believe in this, but I find it fascinating as a concept. And so, basically, psychic medium that they go into trances, but instead of like talking to the family of the dead or whatever, the dead paints through them. And there's some really interesting ones you can find actually online who like share their work and stuff. Like some of them even have Etsy pages, which the one in my book does as well, where they get like spirits come to them, they invite them in, they paint something, like, oh, this is my childhood dog, and then they sell it. Oh, this is the childhood dog of like a 9-year-old girl who died in a train crash, whatever. And people go like, "Oh, that's lovely. I'm going to buy that." Um, Whatever, to each their own. But anyway, she's happily doing that in the New Forest, which is a spooky, spooky place. If you're not from the UK, if you ever want to go somewhere where there are just like horses tramping about and like proper darkness, which you don't really get a lot in the UK. So it's a lovely, lovely place, but also very creepy. And basically, her sister is someone who has been helping refugee charities in the Mediterranean for about a decade. And then in the UK, we have at the moment we have a most unlovely government whose about 40% of their press conferences are performed behind a lectern with a sign saying "Stop the boats," where they want to stop refugees coming into the country because they think that's the biggest deal, which just mind bending. But anyway, this lady who's been helping refugees in the Mediterranean basically sees this kind of thing happening and decides she wants to come back because the fight is no longer in Greece and Italy where it was before. She feels like she can go home and do more good to protect people who are vulnerable there. But when she arrives, her sister has painted someone who has apparently spontaneously combusted. Obviously, she has no control over it because it's the spirit that makes her paint it. And then the next day, a right-wing TV journalist, in inverted commas, turns out to have been horrifically burned in exactly the same fashion. And it kind of only steps up from there. And it's very, like I say, it's very political. It's very anti this kind of like increasingly depressing othering of refugees and demonizing even of refugee populations, which we're seeing in the UK at the moment. But it kind of revolves around the people involved in shaping that policy and that public opinion being burned. And I know why, but obviously readers will have to pick up the book when it comes out, hopefully next year, and see why.
This is insane. This really escalated to spontaneous combustion very quickly indeed.
It's not spontaneous
Oh,
combustion. I can definitely confirm that. But yeah, all will become clear.
I really want to read this one. Do
Okay.
you have a kind of completion date? Do you have a publisher involved in this one?
This is one of the ones that's going to Lichen Valley as one of the folkloric novellas because there is a folklore background to it. Um, I would love to get it out before the UK election this autumn. So I'm like feverishly working away at the draft at the moment. I've been reading this actually a lot with my face-to-face writing group in Lisbon, and I mean I've been reading a lot more generally because I want to kind of, as I said, I get a bit kind of nervous about reading with an audience, so I'm trying
Yeah.
to kind of give myself more courage with that. And of all the things I've read to them, this is the one where like this book generally, the response from them has been like everybody really paying full attention and lots of comments afterwards. So I feel like it's definitely got something. So yeah, I'm hoping that I can shape it together before I go away for the summer in the UK, and maybe they'll get their editors on it while I'm there.
Right, and I understand that there's quite a lot of political turmoil in Portugal at the moment as well, so it's perhaps something that is relatable, at least thematically.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, we've just had a an election where the third biggest party by some sizable margin was basically an anti-immigration sort of right-wing, semi-fascist kind of party. Very anti, even anti-women's rights. Which like, I mean, how can that even be a thing in 2024? And yet.
It's interesting too, because I mean, personally and in your personal life, I know that you're a very political person, for want of better phrasing. It's something that you're very passionate about. It's something that you follow strongly. I mean,
Mm,
in many ways, it's almost like an obligation as a human being to be following what is going on. But it doesn't always feature, at least so overtly, in your writing. So it feels like this is the one where you're like, not only are we getting political, if we're going to do it, that this is political exploitation, as it were. This
Yeah,
is
yeah. We're going to burn
everything
it all down.
in the basket, setting the basket on fire, throwing it in a nuclear reactor. You're not messing about with this one.
No, absolutely. I feel like that's maybe as well because, like, I don't know. I mean, like the way, like for example, in obviously in Italy, there's quite a right wing populist government at the moment. Hungary's a right wing populist government for a long time, and across much of the world that we inhabit, I think we're seeing more and more of this lean to the right, especially in terms of like social policy. Like I say, clamping down on women's rights, clamping down on LGBT rights. People of color being progress we've made in trying to help people of color to be better represented and better able to live like a good life. A lot of that we're seeing people trying to backtrack against that, and I feel as well like I really feel like we are heading, obviously, with some of the climate issues we have, but also global inequality, this kind of thing. We're heading to a situation where probably we're going to see more, not fewer, refugees. And I feel like if we're already demonizing the ones we have now, what is the end game when 10, 15 years down the line, we have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times the number coming in that we have now, which is almost certainly going to happen. And this really scares me, like the whole kind of uh, using language like invasion, like or dehumanizing language about people who just are desperate. Basically, I find this deeply concerning, and I feel like we're not even at the end game yet, and I don't really even want to think about where that is. And so this book is kind of full of all of my rage about that.